Hello fans of the NPL, and welcome to the Miners Season 4 Power Rankings. I am one of your hosts, Richard, and I am not alone. I am joined by my wonderful co-host, Noah, aka No Pun Intended. Why don't you introduce yourself, buddy?
What's going on, everyone? I'm really thrilled to be back here again and ready to get into some Miners Power Rankings.
Yeah, alright, awesome. I am so pumped for this. It seems like it's going to be a great series. But before we get into the actual rankings, I just have a few announcements to say to you all so that you know how the Power Rankings are going to be done this season, because they're going to be done a little bit differently to how they have been in the past. So the first announcement is in regards to the actual overall Power Rankings, how they're going to play out this season. What we're going to be doing is a rapid-fire Power Rankings format where we're going to be going through the teams very quickly. We're not going to be lingering, spending a whole lot of times on the exact details of all the teams and all of their team-building processes. If you want to see those videos, you can go and check out the coaches. Links to all their channels and whatnot will be in the description below, but they make the videos for a reason. That's why, to have people watch them. So if there are any games you are particularly interested in, I do highly recommend that you go check out those videos. The second announcement is going to be with regards to this video, and that is going to be the fact that unlike the rest of the regular season Power Rankings, this video is going to be a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more analytical, in the sense that it's the post-draft preseason rankings, so we're going to be looking at the teams a little bit more in depth. We're still going to try to be as succinct as possible about it, but it will be, like I said, just a little bit longer. So, and also we're going to be doing a grading system based on letters. We have each given them a rating, which you'll see on the screen when the graphics pop up. But after those ratings, we have given them a letter grade based on a scale of all those combined numbers. So that's what you will see. I gave them a rating, Noah gave them a rating, we combined the numbers, and that corresponds to a letter grade. So, with all of that out of the way, I hope that makes sense. It should as we go along, but now we're going to get into the actual rankings, and the first team that we have to talk about here are the Portland Trail Blazekins. Now, I gave them a 2. Noah, you gave them a 5, that gave them a total of 7 and a grade of D+. Why don't you start off with the Portland Trail Blazekins and your views on their team?
Right, so what I'm probably going to be doing is going to my positives first before I get into the negatives, especially for these lower-end teams, just so I'm not too hard on them necessarily. So moving on to the Portland Trail Blazekins, I kind of like that he worked in a budget with his team, as in, like, most of the mons he has, he's not necessarily committed to any of them, like, as these huge investments, so later on after the fact, he can afford to go into free agency and potentially fix up this team. I like that Savali can be flexible, so even though he didn't necessarily draft the best kind of defensive boards for whatever he's trying to do, he can generally adjust the type and fit it into whatever kind of situation he has, and considering it's 12 points, I think that's a very nice asset for him to have. I also think that Wobbuffet plus Linun particularly is disgusting as far as a core. We've seen Wobbuffet plus Orbis work well in other leagues, and I think Linun is enough of a potential sweeping threat where he might get a little bit of success for that for 1 or 2 games. Otherwise, I'm really just not a fan of his bulk. It seems like his team just has a bunch of emptiness about it. Like, he has some good mons, but it's not a necessarily complete team. It seems like he spent more on luxury picks than he did on, say, sturdy mons that he can rely on week in and week out. Also, I generally found that a lot of his mons were going to get locked into specific roles. Tapu Fini is going to be the bulky one because there's not really a lot of bulk on his team. Latias is going to be the Z-mon that he goes for, and if I had this team, I don't necessarily think I'd be able to be as creative as I would want to be with the mons that he has.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of your points there. I mean, he does have some big threats like Mega Pinsir, Zygarde 10%, Superior, but the team really is lacking in team synergy. And in terms of certain team roles like Stealth Rock setters, he only has Mega Pinsir and Pineco that are able to set up rocks, and neither of them are particularly great at doing it unless it's like a Suicide Lead Pineco or something. He has an incomplete Fire Water Grass core, disregarding Silvally and Ditto, who can either have an item to turn them into a fire type or else transform into a fire type. He really has no natural fire type. And on top of that, he has several what I'll call weird or niche or experimental Pokemon, which are Pineco, Wobbuffet, Ditto, and Silvally. And that's not to say that they're bad. They're not bad in any sense. Well, maybe Pineco, but Silvally can be good. Wobbuffet can be good, Ditto can be good, but with all of them on a team together, it may be hard to find a lot of individual use for them. He does have 9 points remaining, so maybe a few trips to free agency or a few trades can help patch some of those holes and fill up some of that empty space that Noah mentioned, But that is about all I have for the Portland Trail Blazekins. Moving on to the next team that we have is the Houston Sol Rockets. I gave them a score of 5.5. You gave them a score of 5 for a total of 10.5 and a grade of C+. I'll just start this one off by saying that I think they have a very strong first 3 to 4 picks. They have Mew, which is the Z user. They have Skarmory, Mega Altaria, Nihilego. They have a very decent defensive and offensive synergy. However, a lot of the mons in the back half of the draft seem to be outclassed by several levels, which is to be expected, but it just seems as though there are too many important roles that are kind of in that zone. For example, Electabuzz is the fast electric pivot, Blaziken is the offensive fire type, and stuff like that are kind of very much outclassed compared to the rest of the drafts. But what is your opinion on the Houston Sol Rockets, Nova?
Yeah, I had a very similar reaction that I did sort of like his first 3 or 4 picks, but the one thing I kind of noticed of as a running theme was that outside of something like, say, Bisharp or Blaziken, he really didn't have too many ways of dealing immediate pressure to opposing teams. It just seems like his offense is all about the setup kind of thing and not really about the just coming in with a Mon after you get revenge killed and providing a lot of immediate pressure to the opponent. On top of that, I noticed he had a very slow roster that I think his fastest Mon was Electabuzz at base 105, and we were talking about like having base 110s or base 125s that don't have to run additional speed investment on there and can instead go offense or even bulk. It just seems like that his opponents are going to be a bit better prepared for them. And at the same time, I don't think that Mega Altaria was necessarily the best Mega selection. It's certainly not bad, but I think that going for round 3, there are other Mons that I would say are definitely more threatening. And beyond that, I think that a couple of his late round picks, like you mentioned, are a bit one-dimensional in their roles at the same time. I'm a big fan of flexibility, as you're going to find out here, and when your Mons generally have 1 or 2 roles they perform well and 3 or 4 roles but they perform like only half-heartedly, it's not really a team that I'm going to give a high grade to in that sense.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And I think we can get into our next team then, the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks, which I rated with a 6, you rated with a 5.5, so a little bit lower. Total of 11.5 and a grade of C+. Why don't you start off with talking about the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks?
Alright, so when you look at all the Mons that the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks have individually, it's easy to get impressed by Mons like Hydreigon, or Melodic, or Mega Medicham in a vacuum. So I did generally like that. I think he made good picks all around. I just failed to see the synergy behind them, as it were. I'm not really that much of a fan of Necrozma in League format. I used it in March Madness, and I would say it completely lost me the matches in pools. It just was not bulky enough, it just was not strong enough, and it needs about 3 or 4 turns of setup to potentially make an impact, I think, over the course of a match. It just can't do that sort of thing individually. It just sits there and fires off Thunder Wave and Stealth Rock, and it's pretty much just a sitting duck. It cannot take hits very well. On top of that, most of the Mons I found he drafted were very specially oriented. He had a lot of special attackers and a lot of Mons that had good special bulk, but on the physical side, he really didn't have very many options. He had kind of like Flygon to take raw type attacks, and really beyond that, I can't really find any sort of way where his opponents may bring 4 or 5 physical attackers against him, and he just doesn't have the roster to be able to take those kind of hits.
Yeah, I will definitely agree with a lot of your points there, and going back to what you said about kind of the caliber of his Pokemon, I definitely agree that a lot of them are solid Pokemon in a vacuum, like Mega Medicham, Heatran, Hydreigon, Roserade, which is obviously the best grass type, I mean, come on. But it's well balanced, but it feels like a safe team in a sense. Like it's only kind of just doing what it needs to get by. And like you said, there's a little bit of a lack of synergy with it, but he does have, you know, the cores filled out. He does have most of the roles filled out. However, what I find this team is lacking is, aside from kind of Thunderous Eye, which is the Z-move user, none of the Mons really seem to stand out. Not like things like Mew, Jirachi, Zapdos, Zygarde, Megalopoly, Tapu Bulu, Kyurem Black, etc. He only has one hazard remover in the form of Flygon, although only one thing on his team is actually weak to Stealth Rock, but it is one of his biggest offensive threats in Thunderous Eye, and the majority of things on his team are grounded, so spikes are going to hurt, and it kind of pressures Flygon to be a support or semi-support role with Defog when an opposing team has a lot of hazard options, making it somewhat predictable, and that is indeed what I would consider a little bit of a flaw. But that's about all I have for them. We can move right along now to the Anaheim Altarias.
Actually, if I can, I just want to say something really quickly. So another thing that I noticed was that, as you mentioned, he has this sort of hazard control issue where he has a defogger, but then he has like Rose Rage for Spike Stack and Necrozma for getting up rocks. But if he wants to be able to properly set that up, and then he gets a bunch of hazards on his side, he's going to have to defog them away, and that's more counterproductive in the long run for him.
Yeah, that's a good point, definitely. Yeah, so then going to the Altarias, I guess, and this is kind of one of our biggest differences. I think we've only ever had a big difference of 3 points. I gave them a 4.5, you gave them a 7.5 for a total of 12 and a grade of B. I guess I'll start off this one. They have a very powerful and offensive team, barring Golbat and Tangrowth, but they have a really good range of speed tiers. However, that's where I think the pros of this draft sort of end. The cons, I think, are that the team verges on hyper offense, which isn't necessarily bad, but it has been proven difficult to use in the past, although I do think that the Gen 7 meta has made hyper offense more viable. What may make it more difficult for the Altarias, though, is a lack of mons with direct recovery, and the only somewhat clerical mon is Megalatios, which does also get direct recovery in the form of Roost, but it likely won't ever fall into a clerical role, meaning that the team can be bulky, but with a purely offensive playstyle, if he goes for that straight hyper offense, it'll mean that a lot of those things are rather frail and won't have a good enough longevity.
I mean, I think you made some pretty darn good points there. The reason I kind of put him a bit higher is because I'm familiar with a lot of his mons. I've used stuff like Tangrowth and Crocodile and Lucario in League format, and I personally am a bit biased toward them. I think they're just amazing in general. I love that he has a few potential switch-ins to certain types. I like that he has a constant offensive pressure field going with the double priority users with Lucario and Azumarill. He's got some nice pivots to help them out. I just think his team is constructed slightly better. There was one thing I was kind of concerned about, and that was U-turn spam against his team, that if you let rocks get up, he didn't really have great bug switch-ins outside of Golbat. And even then, if they're U-turning against Golbat's going to be repeatedly switching on rocks, and it's not going to be able to find the time to get off its roost at all. So I find that he has to kind of play offense in order to get an advantage on his team. But if he does that, I think he can potentially perform well with it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. It's just, a matter of getting that advantage over the other team first and not falling behind in the offensive department, because he doesn't have that many defensive things to kind of pick him up out of the rut if things go south there. But moving on, I think we can talk about the Vancouver Stealth Rocks, which I gave a rating of 6.5. You gave them a rating of 7 for a total of 13.5 and a grade of B. Why don't you start off with talking about Carney's team here?
Yeah, so I actually kind of really like the fact that when Carney drafted, he did take a lot of mons that are like decent worth amount of points. As in, like, he kept to a budget. He didn't necessarily splurge on any single mon. He got a lot of good things that he can potentially bring any day of the week, or any week of the season, I should say. Mega Beedrill, I think, is super threatening. As a mon with base 145 speed and that adaptability, it's going to be tough for opposing teams that don't have many checks to it to be able to handle. And I also like that he got some good hazard removal with Empoleon to potentially help out with that. But aside from that, the fact that he's building around Mega Beedrill means he needs a few specific things. Beyond Empoleon, his hazard removal options are very few and far between. Mega Beedrill kind of gets boxed out by the steel types, and his only main options for that are stuff like Z-Lando or Breloom, which don't necessarily get off the highest power of attacks all the time. He has trouble with removing those hazards unless he wants to turn Avalugg into the Season 4 MVP. And I find that a couple of his picks toward the end of the draft were a bit redundant. Like, he has Gothitelle when he already picked up Uxie as a kind of bulky psychic type, and Shadow Tag has been spotty in terms of success in draft leagues. And then picking up Toxapex, a hazard setter, when he has Empoleon as his main defogger to clear hazards and then set up rocks. So unless he wants to kind of get a pick and choose, his opponents can kind of just plan for both of them because they're similar, and that means that there's not as much of a pressure on them to plan for another threat that would be more different than the roster he already has.
Yeah, very good points there. As for me, what I find that appeals to me about this team, Xehander's T is an immense threat. I hear it hyped up so much. I have never actually used it myself, but I hear it hyped up quite a lot, so hopefully Carney can use it to that hyped effect. And the team overall, to me, what I notice seems relatively balanced defensively and offensively. I think he's got a good mix of bulk and offense, But the first thing that I see sort of missing is that he has no fire type, which seems to be the type to miss from the Fire Water Grass core, as we have seen, or will see, with a couple of the other teams here that also lack a fire type. The team also lacks both a dragon and a fairy type, leaving his team a bit weak to dragon spam with only one resist in Empoleon, and I think many dragon types do get access to Earthquake, so the team may struggle with that by only having one portion of the Dragon Steel Fairy core being quite open to dragons, not being able to do much against them nor defend against them very easily. So the Colorado Avalugs, why don't you start this off as well? I gave them a 7, you gave them a 6.5, 13.5 total, grade of B. What makes the Colorado Avalugs stand out and also have some drawbacks in your opinion?
I saw those first 2 picks they made with Mega Charizard X and Cody, and I'm like, wow, that is actually really cool. It's just plain offense. There's mons are different enough to the point where not a lot of teams are going to be preparing around them when they initially draft their mons. So those 2 can provide a decent bit of offensive pressure. And I looked at the mons they also drafted, and I saw mons like Florges fills the wish passing role, mons like Nidoking for the offensive role, Jolteon's nice bit of speed momentum. There's a lot of cool mons here, but what really kind of made me put them down in the rankings was that many of the mons that he drafted in those later rounds are specifically tailored to one set. As I mentioned before, I'm a big fan of flexibility, and when I see stuff like Mandibuzz, which is going to be bulky, Shuckle, which is going to be bulky, Chansey, which is going to be the wall that eats up special hits all the time, I don't really see very much flexibility with this team. He has a couple mons suited to those specific roles, and I think his opponent is just going to be able to see something like Florges and say, oh, well, I can just bring a fire type or a steel type, and I won't have very much issue with it. Nidoking just brings something that can outspeed it or potentially take a hit if it's scarfed, and it kind of seems like his opponent's teams will have a bit of a paint by numbers kind of game, trying to just figure out, like, okay, I can just counter his mons by going with this particular strategy, and there's not a lot of surprise he can get out with this draft.
Yeah, so I just want to say, Shuckle, just no, Fog, no, I'm sorry. Chansey...
He's got infestation.
It does.
He's got infestation toxic. He can definitely work something there.
Disgusting fat turtle. Chansey, to talk about Chansey as well, is it's potential setup fodder. I'm sorry, it's a great damage sponge. I know you love it, Fog, but it really is a passive wall, and if you don't use it correctly, it could cost you the match. I do agree with all of your other points. I mean, his team looks great just going by team composition. He has a formidable Fire, Water, and Grass and Dragon Steel Fairy core, fast electric pivot, good balance of bulk and offense, surprisingly for Fog, because I know that he actually really loves stall and semi-stall and stuff like that. He has hazard setters, hazard removers, clerics, strong standalone mons, etc. But I think, like you said, the biggest drawback is the versatility of the mons. I don't think that most of them are necessarily one-dimensional. I think they all have a potential to be run rather creatively, but they may more accurately be two-dimensional. And like you were saying, mons that you kind of know what they're going to do. I think that's what holds the draft back a little bit. Like, you know that Zardex is either going to be setup sweeper or bulky offense. You know that Jolteon is likely the offensive electric pivot with Scarf or Specs. You know that Florges is either going to be a special wall or a Calm Mind attacker, maybe Specs. And I think almost all of the things on his team are like that. But enough kind of ranting about Fog's team. Let us move on now to the Rosa-Radenborg, which is one of the teams that we actually agree on with the rating. I gave them a 7, you gave them a 7, for a total of 14 and a grade of B+. I guess I will start off this one with talking about Daniki's team. I think that Kyurem Black and Celesteela and Mimikyu is a very, very intimidating Dragon Steel Fairy core. Like, it's so powerful. Kyurem with the really high offensive prowess, Celesteela being a great defender, and Mimikyu having this kind of really cool niche that's somewhat hard to play around in certain circumstances. Celesteela and Nidoqueen have decent defensive synergy, with Celesteela being immune to ground and resistant to psychic, and Nidoqueen being immune to electric. He has very fast offensive threats in Greninja, Azelf, and Mega Manectric. However, again, we have an incomplete Fire Water Grass core where he is missing a fire type like a couple of the other teams, although Mega Manectric does get strong fire coverage in, I think, Overheat and Flamethrower. And, as for the rest of the core, Greninja and Virizion don't really function as much of a core, so with the missing fire type, it's practically a non-existent core. Not that it's the most important core, I think the Dragon Steel Fairy core has a bit more functionality in a draft league, but those are just some of the holes I see with this team. I think it's a good team overall, but what do you have to say about the Rosa-Radenborg?
Yeah, I largely very much agree with all of your points. This is I would say, a pretty nice sort of balanced team. He's got the offensive threats, he's got some decent bulk, although it doesn't really have recovery, which kind of dropped him down a bit in my ranks. And he's got some really fast offensive threats. I kind of do get the sense of a bit of that a couple of his Mons are... Well, he's going to have an issue with his Mons being worn down over the course of the game, with his main forms of recovery being Leech Seed from Celesteela, Roost on Gligar, Synthesis on Virizion, Roost on Kyurem Black. If you ever wanted to run like a sub-Roost set or something, you could potentially do that. But a lot of the Mons that I see just in general, like, I think that they have a couple good points about them, but they're either, a lot of his Mons are either too frail or too slow or just prone to getting beaten down by momentum and hazards and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with a lot of those points. And moving on, I guess, now to another team, or another set of differences where we have a 3-point gap in our ratings. The Montreal Habsols, which I've rated at 9, you have rated them at a 6. Do you want to go and start off about why you think the Montreal Habsols deserve a 6?
So I find it kind of funny, but this is probably the team that we disagree on the most. I had them in my bottom 5, you had them in your top 5. I thought that was pretty kind of cool, actually. But for me, the Habsols have some really, really good, powerful wall breakers. Those first 3 picks, Tapu Bulu, Victini, Mamoswine. I don't think there's a single Mon in the... If you can think of a single Mon in the draft format that can potentially stop all 3 of them, good on you. I can't think of it right now. I think Z-Mens is a great choice as a Z-Move user. I think he's got some good momentum with Mons like Vikavolt if he ever chooses to bring them to specific matches. And I think his opponents will struggle in necessarily getting switch-ins to that physical offense if he continues to bring it. But what really kind of brought him down into my bottom 5 is that he only has 2 forms of hazard removal for a team that's going to have that momentum with Mons like Victini and Vikavolt. His offense is generally a bit on the slower side, and thus it makes it somewhat easier to revenge kill. Victini can get Pursuit Trapped, and Tapu Bulu and Mamoswine are like at base 75 and 80 respectively. Those 3 pivots are going to probably be getting chipped down over the course of the match if the opponent can properly switch around between them. I don't like that he has Cresselia and Umbreon together as those 2 fat Mons, because I think they're just so passive in what they do. They have to rely on that, and that can give his opponents an opening to bring in an offensive threat set up and potentially sweep his team. And I don't think his team had a flying resist on it whatsoever, so he was also vulnerable to bird spam. So those were many of the points I felt that I had to put Montreal toward the bottom of my power rankings. I'm kind of actually interested to see why you put them up so highly at a 9.
I mean, Vikavolt's kind of an electric, or sorry, a flying. No, actually no, because it's part bug, isn't it? Never mind.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Kavali's the same way.
Yeah. And I mean, it's as an electric pivot, it's not something I've seen used before. You seem to think it has potential, but that was actually one of the things that I tried to nitpick in my cons. Another thing that I saw as kind of like a defect of this team, you mentioned the offense being on the slower side. Definitely, because Cobalion is the fastest at base 108, and then there's Salamence and Victini at base 100. So it definitely is a bit of a slower offensive team, although he does have ways to increase the speed, like Salamence, I believe, gets Dragon Dance, and Cobalion, I think, gets Rock Polish, maybe? Yeah. So he does have ways to increase his speed, but just naturally it's not the fastest. I think what really, I guess, stood out for me was the synergy of the team. He has really, really strong cores. His massive offensive threats like Salamence, like Victini, and a couple of the other things. And his walls are very, very bulky. But you did bring up a point that I didn't think about, I guess, when I was looking at the team. Umbreon and Cresselia together as a bulky wall core are both very weak to bug, so you can bring just a really strong bug type attacker and break through both of those walls. Of course, he could always use Cobalion as a third member of the wall core to kind of stop those bugs, but still, it's maybe I did rate them a little bit too highly. I might have been a little bit hyped because when I was, just before I kind of rated this team, I had watched Aster's interview and he kind of hyped up his team and I was like, yeah, that's a great team. I don't know, maybe I put them a little too high. I still don't think I would give them any lower than like a 8 or 7 maybe.
That's fair.
There's very strong cores and the mess of offensive and defensive threats really just kind of sold me on it, so. But I think that's enough about the Montreal Habsols. We can move on to the Bullet Plunge Club, which I have given a rating of 7, you have given them a rating of 8, a total of 15, and a grade of B+. And So the Bullet Punch Club, for me, the things that really stand out about their team as being a pretty strong team is they have a very, very strong Dragonsteel Fairy core in his first 3 picks. Jirachi, Z Dragonite, and Mega Diancie. Very, very solid team synergy just overall. However, the cons I think of this team are that the Tentacruel is really the only hazard remover, not counting Mega Diancie's Magic Bounce, and I feel like that can be a bit of an issue with Dragonite, especially being one of the main offensive threats, because obviously it can be decently fast, but it's not the fastest thing, and most of what it can do, it either may get outsped or needs a turn to set up to its thing, and if that multi-scale is broken, it's not going to have as much survivability in order to be able to pull off those things that it can do. So having only one hazard remover is a little bit risky for stuff like Dragonite and other mons on his team.
Yeah, I can definitely see that on that end. I also kind of agree with the whole Stealth Rock weakness, being that he has a Mon and Rotom that is going to be momentum grabbing all the time, and a Mon and Dragonite that's going to have to worry about chinking its multi-scale whenever it comes in. I also found that of the Mons that he kind of could use to not have much issue with Stealth Rocks, a lot of them are weak to ground, so he did have to worry about the combo of Stealth Rock plus Earthquake on a single Mon being a huge threat for his team. But the reason I gave him a sort of higher grade was because the mons that he did pick to kind of counteract that, I'm a big fan of. Buzzwole is one of my man-crush mons, I suppose you could call it. It's just, I'm a huge fan of that thing, even with the 4x flying weakness, even with the low special defense. I think it has enough offensive coverage and pressure on it where Uzi can put it into a good position, and I'm a huge fan of his late round picks with Gourgeist and Piloswine to help alleviate the weaknesses he has on his team. Those two are really, really nice late round budget steals at their position. And Mega Diancie with the speed tier changes in Gen 7 I think is a vastly underrated threat as well. So my point would be a couple of really, really, really good mons push this team up. If he can figure out the synergy with around Stealth Rocks and other hazards, I think his team will be set.
Yeah, definitely. But I think we can move on to another team, actually, that we both agree on with a rating, the FC Popplio, which we've both given a rating of 7.5 for a total of 15, another grade of B+. And why don't you start off with talking about the FC Popplio?
So the first thing I noticed about FC Popplio is that a lot of their bulky mons are mons that I would love to use in a draft. And the main reason I would is even though mons like Rotom and Klefki and Crobat don't necessarily have the best defensive stats, they have great typings. So they can switch into a bunch of potentially threatening mons just based off of that. His offense has some really scary setup to go alongside the Hoobayu's immediate power. He's got the Quiver Dance on the Venomoth. He has Swords Dance on Kabutops. And I find that his mons again have somewhat of that versatility factor alongside Hoopa, which I think is probably the best Z user in the draft. A couple of the reasons I put him down lower, when he's relying so much on types to be his main defensive check, he's going to have a situation where one potential mon is going to bring like 3 or 4 different kinds of moves and have either a normally effective strong move or a super effective move to hit his entire team. I'm kind of worried about that unknown factor to it, where that sort of situation might happen. I mean, he has to rely quite a bit on Hoopa-Yu and Garchomp to be able to be the cornerstones of his team, the foundation towards his success. And while I do really, really like Hoopa-Yu and Garchomp as his first 2 picks, I feel like the other mons against the wrong team, he might not have potential options to get his way around them.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add. I think you covered all of that perfectly. One of the things that really stood out was just the power that Z Hoopa Unbound could potentially bring, and he does have many important team roles filled. He does have, like you said, Garchomp, things that are really strong, but the thing that holds this team back for me is the fact that it really doesn't seem very synergetic. Like you said, a few types could kind of mess up his defensive core because he does have a little bit of type redundancy. So basically what I'm saying is that yes, I agree with you, and it's kind of cool that we both gave them a 7.5 rating. Although I also like when we disagree quite heavily, because it's really interesting to see, such as in the next team that we have here, the Rotterdam Staraptors, which is another 3-point gap. I gave them a 10, and you gave them a 7, for a total of 17 and a grade of A-. I guess I'll start off talking about what I see really, really stands out about the Rotterdam Staraptors. So first of all, they have a very solid team with a bit of everything. They have Voltron Momentum, strong Fire, Water, Grass, and Dragonsteel Fairy cores, Hazard Setters, multiple forms of hazard removal, Cleric options, a few mons with direct recovery, Ghost-type Spin Blocker, nice bulk, great offense, and almost all of the mons that fit these roles are pretty quality mons for those purposes, the only real budget mons being the bottom three, Lickilicky, Electrode, and Leafeon, which arguably can still perform their respective roles reasonably well. And what may give those lower tier picks a little bit of a boost, and what makes the Rotterdam Staraptors draft unique, is that both the Electrode and Leafeon can potentially be Z-move users. The Miners draft system had this clause where if a mon, or if multiple mons were below a certain point total, you could have multiple mons be a Z-move user. So in this case, Electrode and Leafeon were both 2 points. I don't know what the threshold was for that rule, but because their total was only 4 points, it was low enough that he could make them both Z-move users, and that really turns them into bigger threats and makes his opponents have to try to prepare for his entire draft, because nothing on his team is dead weight in any capacity. However, when we get to the cons, I don't really have much to say, honestly. It's very difficult to come up with heavy critiques of this draft. Initially, I wanted to give it a 7.5, and then an 8.5, and then a 9.5, because I felt like it was just missing something. Maybe you can kind of fill in what the thing might be, but the more I tried to look into it, the less I knew what that something was, and so that's why I decided to bump them up to a 10, but I still do have this intuition that something isn't totally right with the team. We'll see how it pans out in the season, but I'm going to let you talk about them now and maybe point out some of the flaws in this draft.
Right, so I definitely agree with all of your good points. I'm a fan of Gengar. I think it's a very nice mon for only 12 points. I think it's highly underrated for that price. I like that he got 2 good pursuit trap options with T-Tar and Scizor to help out Infernape and Guard, who sort of have some issues with bulky Psychics in the format. Main reasons why I didn't necessarily give him a perfect score, as it were, is because his draft has a couple 4 times weak mons that I think can be exploited with hidden powers, although the fact that he got multiple 4 times weak mons will help with the hidden power issue. I'm skeptical of Scizor as the steel type in his Dragon Fury Steel Core. I've used it before, and I just find that whenever I want to take a specific really hard hit, it usually doesn't have the stat line to be able to do that. And I'm really skeptical of his Z-move choice. Like, I understand going for the low tier mons and getting 2 Z-move users. That I don't have an issue with. What does kind of bother me is that he chose Electro and Leafeon, who are not very well known for having the best coverage moves in the world. I actually looked through their entire move pools prior to this, and the only coverage moves that that Electrode and Leafeon get are dark moves and bug moves. So in total, even though he put Z Crystals on 2 mons, he only really has 4 types of moves, including the stab moves of Electro and Leafeon, that he can necessarily rely on for his Z Crystals. And even considering that he does have the option of 2, I don't think there's going to be very many situations where he's going to bring both Electro and Leafeon, and his opponent is going to have to guess which one of them has the Z Crystal, which I think is one of the hugest assets towards getting the 2 Z Crystal users. And hey, there might not even be weak spray rings either of Electro and Leafeon. And if that doesn't happen, I find that most of his higher tier mons really don't have very many answers for bulky waters. I think that if he gave something like Infernape or Gengar the Z Crystal, he would have a lot more options for that, either going with Gigabolt Havoc with Infernape's Thunder Punch or Gengar's Thunderbolt. I just think that there'll be a few matchups where he will struggle overall.
I mean, if he's facing a really strong ground type and he needs his Electrode for a pivot, but he needs something to defend, Leafeon, I don't know, maybe. I think you made a lot of good points, though, and definitely pointed out some of those flaws that I kind of maybe knew were there, but just didn't see initially. I still think it has the potential to be one of the top drafts. I don't think I would revoke my 10 rating, maybe give it a 9.5, but
I think in retrospect, I probably would put him up maybe at half a point or another point by that, but I'm not necessarily sure he's a 10, but 7 is still a very good score. Most of these drafts are good. That is the one thing I want to get out of the way, even though I didn't give anyone lower than a 5, they definitely have their positive points, and even if they could definitely use some work in free agency, right now, they're good enough to go for week 1.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like, I was looking, when I was doing these ratings, I was looking for teams to put at lower ratings. Like, I was actually looking to put teams at low ratings, and I was just very surprised at how strong a lot of these drafts actually were. So, very pleased and a little bit disappointed that I didn't get to rag on certain teams, but very pleased to see that a lot of the teams have been drafting really well, and it should be a very competitive season, so I'm happy to see that at least. But I think moving on, we can talk about the North Carolina Tyrannus Tar Heels, coached by my boy Parker, who I'm supporting in the Miners fan server thing. And I gave them a team rating of 8. You gave them team rating of 9, so a little bit higher than I did. I actually feel a little bit bad about myself not giving them a higher rating. But I can't pick favorites, you know. I have to be honest. It's a total of 17 and a grade of A-. It's in our top 5, so it's definitely not a bad draft. I guess I'll start off with why I gave them an 8. And the thing that I really liked about this team is that he has a very, very strong Mega, which is one of my favorite Megas in the format. I actually drafted it a season, and it did a lot of work for me, which is Mega Lopunny. He has a really good Defogger and a good Rapid Spinner in Zapdos and Donphan, so he has both of those, and really good mons for both of those roles, so that's really awesome. He has Volcanion with a Z move, which can be an enormous threat. He has many important team roles filled. He has potential Clerics in Gardevoir and Celebi. He has Hazard Setters in Donphan, Celebi, Frostlass, Registeel, Ariados. All of those mons can set hazards, which is really cool. He has a lot of hazard removers, well, maybe not a lot, but he has, Zapdos and Donphan, and he has another hazard remover, I think. So, and they're really good at what they do. He has great type diversity. He has every type except for Rock on his team, in terms of the Pokemon's types. And his worst Pokemon is arguably Ariados, and it can still put in a lot of work in some matchups. None of his Pokemon have to run gimmicks to be effective. Let me repeat, none of his Pokemon have to run gimmicks to be effective. And that's not to say that they shouldn't or that they can't, because there are definitely going to be some situations in which you want to, but nothing on his team, at least on paper, is dead weight. However, what holds his team back for me is I noticed that he has a very big fire weakness, at least in comparison to other type weaknesses that I try to look for throughout the rest of the drafts. And his team happens to be have 4 mons that are weak to fire and only 2 resists, and both of those resists happen to be weak to rock, and he also has what I would call a rock difficulty, in the sense that he has 5 things that are weak to rock. He does have 3 resists to it, but still, rock and fire weakness, especially with how big Stealth Rock is in the format and just in Pokemon in general, competitive Pokemon in general, he's gonna maybe struggle a little bit with that, although, he does have the really good hazard removers in Zapdos and Donphan, so maybe not as much, but with rock-type attacks, for sure, it might give him a little bit of a trouble. And in terms of the fire weakness, like I said, a lot of teams kind of opted out of the fire-type Pokemon for their Fire, Water, Grass core, so he may not have as much to worry about, but still, those teams that do have fire coverage or fire mons will kind of put in a little bit of work against him. But what do you see in Parker's draft that maybe puts him a little bit higher for you?
Well, first off, I definitely agree with you that the fire type problem is definitely something that he's going to have to look at. I did kind of give him points because Registeel, I think, even though it is a steel type, it has enough special bulk where it can tank fire type attacks, and Volcanion is just an amazing fire type switch in as it is, that I don't think it'll be a problem. As far as why I gave him my second highest draft grade, I really love Alolan Muck as a psychic remover for Mega Lopunny. I have Alolan Muck as my profile picture on the NPL fan Discord server, and there's a reason why. It's probably the mon I think is the most fun to use in Generation 7 just because of its powerful knockoffs and its powerful pursuit trappers. I agree with the good removal aspects to his team. I agree that his team is generally kind of bulky. I am a fan of Ariados as a late round pick just because it's very, very cheap, and the presence of Sticky Web and Toxic Spikes, if anything, is really helpful. But other than that, I generally agree with a lot of points. His team covers a lot of the bases that a draft team needs. Even though he has 11 mons that he's drafted, any 6 that he brings will be a very threatening team for an opponent to have to prepare for.
And I think that's going to be a common theme that we see amongst these top 5 teams here, and as we move into the top 4 team, the San Francisco Arcaniners, I think that's definitely true of them as well. I've given them a 9, you've given them an 8 for a total rating of 17 and a grade of A-. Do you want to start off and maybe talk about the San Francisco Arcaniners a little bit?
Right, I can definitely do that. So there's no better place to start off with the San Francisco Arcaniners draft than Manaphy. And as a frequent user of Manaphy in Draft League format, I find that every single pick you make with Manaphy has to be tailored to some kind of specific purpose. With that being said, I think George did a fairly good job of getting compliments for Manaphy, necessarily, in getting these maybe slower offensive threats, picking up Cofagrigus as a very bulky, physically defensive mon, getting Galvantula for T-Spikes, Emboar to clear the way out of bulky grass types, as well as Braviary for doing much the same thing. I think his individual picks are very nice, and the 2 picks he made after Manaphy and with Hippowdon and Fortress, really nice hazard setters that are also really, really bulky mons to stomach the hits and prepare Manaphy for that late game sweep. And much like we talked about with Parker and his draft, I find that, again, he could bring any of the 11 mods he has on a team, and it wouldn't necessarily be like a very gimmicky set. Why I kind of put him down not as an 8 instead of a 10 is more because of the fact that his switch-ins to both electric and grass, his main one is going to be Mega Sceptile, which is generally a frailer mon whenever it comes in. So in spite of the fact it does well against Manaphy's weakness, I'm not sure he's going to have the trigger finger to pull off that switch when he needs to. I find that this team is going to have to play rather aggressively because there's a lot of offense to it, but he doesn't, besides Hippowdon and Fortress, he doesn't really have the same kind of defensive bulk that I was kind of hoping for, like the pivots to be able to switch into hits and then provide an opportunity for his offense to work. But I'm actually interested to see your grade as well. You gave him a pretty high score too, I believe.
Yeah, I gave him a 9. The thing that kind of held this team back from being a 10 is, again, I have a little bit of a problem with Mega Sceptile like you did. And it's not to say that it's a bad mon in and of itself. I personally have not seen it used much in Draft League, but that I think it definitely has potential, and I'm eager to see how he uses it. But my problem with it is that it's his only dragon type, and as it's part grass, it's neutral to fire type attacks, and with his steel type being 4 times weak to fire and his fairy type only being neutral to fire, it makes a very important core somewhat susceptible to fire. But like we said before, fire types are kind of lacking in the draft this season. I think 3 or 4 teams don't have one. And it's a relatively small issue with Manaphy there to sponge fire attacks and weaken them with Rain Dance, so it's not too much of a flaw. Like you said, Z Manaphy is definitely a threat. Can we talk about the fact that Emboar was only listed at 10 points? I thought it was a great steal at 10 points.
Same price as Scopagus too. That's crazy.
Yeah. So, Emboar, definitely a good pickup. I think the team is overall just very powerful, and I think that's why I put them up so high, or at least 1 point above you. But I think that's all I have on the San Francisco Arcaniners. I think now we can move on to our top 3 team, the Oklahoma City Thunderous, which is the only other team that we gave a same rating to at 8.5 for a total of 17 and a grade of A-, as you can see on the screen. And I guess I'll start off with talking about the Oklahoma City Thunderous. They are stacked with huge threats in Zygarde 50%, Tapu Koko, Tornadus T, Starmie, Z Volcarona can be an absolute nuke. They have really solid Fire, Water, Grass, and Dragon Steel Fairy cores, multiple hazard setters, and it's just a very threatening team overall. However, they don't have a Ghost type, which somewhat undermines his hazard stacking options, and he only has 2 hazard removers with 3 things weak to Stealth Rock, one of which is a Volcarona, which takes up to 50% on switch-in. Now, mind you, one of those hazard removers is Starmie, which is one of the best rapid spinners in the game, but the other is Mega Aerodactyl with Defog, which it will almost never run, so it puts a lot of pressure on Starmie to be the hazard remover, which, as we discussed with Flygon and the Chicago Kyurem Blackhawks, makes it a little bit predictable. But what do you have to say about this team?
Yeah, you pretty much covered what I had to say with the offense. It's offense, offense, offense most of the time. And that's the main thing with this draft that the Oklahoma City Thunderous's draft has, that immense pressure that other teams might not be able to compete with because they generally drafted more balanced teams. The big issue I have with the Oklahoma City Thunderous's draft is that his speed tiers, he has a lot of very fast mons, and he has a lot of very slow mons. But in between Aromatisse at like base 29 and Drapion and Zygarde at base 95 speed, I believe he only has Seismitoad as a potential option. So that other teams that necessarily see that have mons at base 50, base 60 speed, if they can outspeed Seismitoad, they don't really need to run any kind of speed whatsoever. They can instead just focus on offense or bulk. And I think that's kind of an underrated sort of problem I have, that in general, if teams actually watch these draft power rankings, they might be able to eventually pick on them. But yeah, I definitely agree with you on the offense. It's the main reason I have him in my top 3 drafts.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back to a point where earlier when I was talking about the Anaheim Altarias and their offensive team and why I only gave them a 4.5 for their offense versus the offense that some of these higher tier teams have brought. Again, it goes back to something I already mentioned, but I just want to reiterate so that people who may be lost by now don't kind of wonder about it, is that the frailty and the longevity of the mons. Like, you think of Zygarde, it has really great natural bulk on the Thunderous's team, the Zygarde 50%. The Tapu Koko, it is a little bit frail, but it has electric terrain, it does fancy stuff. Tornadus T has Regenerator, Starmie has Recover. So these things, they can kind of take a hit, they have enough bulk to take a hit generally, and then kind of have direct recovery to keep their their things bolstered. I know Tapu Koko. Does Tapu Koko get Roost?
I believe it does, yeah.
So, I don't know. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think it does, but if it does, then that's another...
It does.
Alright.
I can confirm that now. It does.
So, yes. So, these things all have kind of, that direct recovery or enough bulk to take hits and do things and still be offensive. So, that's kind of the difference there. But I think we can move on now to our top 2 team, the Jersey Dwebbles, which is the only other team I gave a 10. You gave them an 8. And that earns them a total of 18, and one of our A teams, none of the teams actually got the, spoilers, none of the teams actually got the coveted A+, which was a perfect 20, but 18 is close enough, and it's a pretty good grade. I guess
let's just say, I was a bit of a hard ass. That's why no one got the A+.
He was nice to the people on the lower end of the spectrum, and I was a bit mean to them, but I was a little bit more lenient on the higher end of the spectrum. The teams that impressed me really impressed me, but going into the Jersey Dwebbles, let's talk about them. They have a remarkably well-balanced and synergetic... Remarkably well-balanced and synergetic team. Weavile and Mega Scizor, very, very scary. They have really good hazard control, they have a few defoggers and a rapid spinner, but I think that the most impressive thing about this draft is that he managed to draft this well at number 8 in the draft order. And in a snake draft, it's not the easiest position to work with. I think the only position that's worse than that is rank 9, because of the fact that if you go all 11 rounds, the first half of the draft gets there before, number 9 in the position, but it's still probably one of the, harder to work with draft positions, and he still drafted a really fantastic, solid team. However, what I see as some of the problems of this team, they're a bit flying weak. He has 3 things that are weak and 2 resist, but he does have ways around it, especially with 2 Intimidate Mons for physically offensive flying types, which I think tends to be the majority. He also does have a little bit of a fairy weakness as well with, again, 3 weak and 2 resist, but that can also be dealt with, especially if it's a physically offensive fairy, which again is covered by Intimidate. But why do you have them a little bit lower?
So I generally agree with you on your offense point. This team is offense, offense, offense. In fact, it's actually closer to setup, 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 because all of his mons can potentially run Swords Dance or Nasty Plot or Dragon Dance or some other move that potentially gets that. But unlike some of the other teams I mentioned, their setup was the only real offense they had. Mons like Weavile and Gyarados are threatening off without setup, where they can handle that offensive pressure. On top of that, I love Manectric as an electric immunity, which he didn't have prior to taking it for 3 points. I think the ability to absorb those electric attacks really ties the team together and makes things easier on Gyarados. As far as why I didn't give him a perfect score like you did, I generally had issues with the fact he had only 2 Stealth Rockers, and they were both generally low-tier, bulkier Mons. So if he wanted to bring his main 6 offensive threats and potentially force switch-ins, he didn't really have a great Mon to be able to set up hazards with on his side. And in general, I found that his Scald switch-ins were somewhat lacking. Like, most of the Mons that he had that would potentially try to switch into Scald would be physical attackers, so they would take the risk of getting burned. If he brought something like Special Decidueye or Special Komodo, he could potentially avert that, but then he kind of has to manipulate his team just to get around Scald. But I generally agree with you. I like this offense. I think this team is definitely going to, this is probably the 4th time I've said this, put a lot of pressure on their opponents.
Yeah, I mean, offense is a really big strategy this generation. It just, depends on whether you can keep that offense around long enough to do its work. And these top-tier teams, I think, definitely can. But I think we're going to move on to the last team, the main Red Clawitzers, team number 1, just for the fact that you actually scored them. We both scored them a little bit higher than we both scored the previous team, which your lowest score that you gave them was an 8, and so this team, main Red Clawitzers, as you can see on the screen, I've given them an 8.5. Noah has given them his highest rating at 9.5 for a total of 18 and an A-ranked team. Let me just read off the first 7 Mons of this draft. Clefable, Latias, Excadrill, Scolipede, which is the Z-move user, Vaporeon, Entei, Xurkitree, and then in the 9th round he picks up Mega Venusaur. Oh my Arceus, that is a lot of star power. All very threatening Mons, and they fill out the Fire, Water, Grass, and Dragonsteel Fairy cores very nicely. And all of the Mons I just listed were priced between 12 and 16 points in the draft, so they definitely weren't cheap. Unfortunately, that may be one of the drawbacks of their draft. In the 8th round, he picked up Scrafty for 6 points, and now it isn't a terrible Mon, but it definitely is not at the caliber of the others on his team. And after picking up Mega Venusaur in the next round, he was left with only 1 point, which isn't a whole lot to work with. He ended up picking Lopunny as his 10th pick, which I don't see coming to more than 1, maybe 2 games, so he barely managed to get 10 Mons. Only 8 of them are very likely to come every week, and while those Mons are all very good at what they do, it's much easier to prep for 8, maybe 9 possibilities than a full roster of 11. But that's just what I see. I'm going to let you have less say on this team, your highest rated team. Why are the main Red Clawitzers great?
I mean, responding to your point that Lopunny may only come to 1 or 2 games, I don't know. It might be able to get off a clutch Thunder Wave on something so that Xurkitree can potentially get an offensive sweep on a Mon that it's actually faster than. I generally agree with you. The Firewater Grass Core he has and the Dragon Fairy Steel Core that he has are so good. Those are just going to be able to tank so many different hits from opposing teams. And he also got the very scary Speed Pass core of Scolipede into Xurkitree. If anyone has played in March Madness, a Scolipede Xurkitree team completely 5-0 and 6-0 like almost every team they went against in March Madness. Now, I know that was an 8-mon format. This is an 11-mon format. There are more potential answers to that, but it's still something where if I had to prep against this team and I had the Dragon Fairy Steel Core and the Firewater Grass Core and the potential Speed Pass into Xurkitree or some of his other really strong Mons, I would maybe have to spend 3 or 4 days prepping for this one team. It's that good.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really scary team. I could have given them a 9. I just went with the 8.5 because, like I said, there's that little bit of lacking in, the Lopunny, Scrafty thing.
The main reason I didn't give them a 10 necessarily is mostly the same reason you did, that he only really drafted 10 Mons, and of those, I would say that there's only 8 that are going to be coming to most of his games. So if he had maybe managed to stretch his budget a bit better and get 11 Mons total, I would have given him a 10.
Yeah. I think that's going to conclude our power rankings. Sorry this went a little bit longer than expected. We're going to try to keep the other ones very rapid fire in the future. But I would just like to say thank you, Noah, for being my co-host. You're awesome. I'm looking forward to working with you in the past, looking forward to working with you in the future very much.
Time traveler, Richard.
I know, right? I know my times and stuff. I'm not a wibbly-wobbly ball of timey-wimey randomness.
And it's certainly been a pleasure to work with you as well.
Alright, awesome. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Thank you for tuning in, especially if you made it all the way through. And have a good night. Or day.
See you guys.
Or time of whatever it is for you. We're out.
Goodbye.